Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. And as I said before, Mike Scott's newscast, my understanding from the philosophy of government that prevails, particularly in Illinois, is that you are supposed to just try to get as much money as you can, regardless of the source, regardless of the implications, from wherever you can get it. That's serving your constituents. And so when the Senate president sends a letter to the congressional delegation calling for a $41 billion bailout of Illinois, or $41 billion in disaster relief for Illinois, they'd say $20 billion of which would go to state and local pensions.
Right.
That's called good representation, because what government is all the governors and all the legislators and all the 50 states just getting into a big wind tunnel money machine and grabbing as much as they can for their constituents.
Slow your roll there, partner.
That's good government.
Because Governor Pritzker on Saturday said he had no idea Harmon was doing that. Didn't consult with him at all. They didn't even discuss it. I just find that very hard to believe, but yeah.
The question is, though, and this is so now that we're rethinking all of these things about how our free society is organized and how it will be organized going forward, where our soft spots are, maybe learning some things about our fellow citizens that are good and some things that are not so good. Snitch culture would be on the not so good ledger, as we discussed earlier in the show with Mason County, Michigan Sheriff Kim Cole. What about our philosophy of government? Is that what representation is? That's what it seems like in certain quarters. Are there any implications to that? By the way, this against the backdrop of Illinois' credit being downgraded by Fitch again on Friday to where now we're just a tick above that Nigerian prince that's always emailing you for money.
That's not for real, Dan? I thought for sure that was real.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Bob Pozen. He's a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, former chairman of MFS Investment Management, and he wrote a good piece that we talked a bit about with Victoria Guida from Politico last week. A Fed bailout is wrong for states and cities. Bite your tongue. Bob Pozen, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
So what's wrong with, for example, in Illinois, as you know, largest unfunded pension liabilities in the country, taking this opportunity because the budget has taken an additional hit, as every state budget has, to say, hey, we really need $20 billion right now to prop up our state and local pension funds. That's just good representation.
Well, it's very understandable that Illinois representatives are pressing for more money. The question is whether the federal government ought to grant that request. From the federal point of view, you got to look at all of the states, and some of them have done a great job at managing their pension funds. For example, the Wisconsin state system is over 90% funded and has assets to cover most of the liabilities. By contrast, in Illinois, last time I looked, it was about 31 or 33%, depending exactly how you calculate it. So I think the federal government would have to balance this, and that states like Wisconsin that have done a good job would really object if states that had done a poor job of managing their pension liabilities were just bailed out. So I think the key is this. Right now, all of the federal lending money and the federal purchases of bonds is going through the Fed, through a very complex system that's backed by the U.S. Treasury. In fact, the U.S. Treasury is on the line to absorb all loan losses. And that's why the Fed so far has focused on, in the municipal area, on just short-term notes where it's very likely, hopefully, to get paid back. But that's why I don't think it's the right thing if the Fed were to extend this program to longer-term municipal bonds or bailouts. That's the sort of thing Congress ought to debate up front, have an open debate. Obviously, states that did a good job of managing their pension funds would have some real concerns about just bailing out states like Illinois. And I don't know what the result would be, but I think that just to give money to states that have done a poor job managing their pension
Right.
funds without conditions would be a really bad thing. And that if that's going to happen, it should be tied to some pretty strict conditions so that these state systems would really be reformed and become much more viable.
And, they always say never let a good crisis go to waste, and Illinois is the king of that right now. Who ultimately is going to decide, though? Is it a group of people? What state gets what? How much money?
I think ultimately it will be a congressional decision. First, Congress has to authorize these sorts of bailouts, and in that they would have to set up some general criteria, and then probably the U.S. Treasury, and they would set up a special task force, would decide how to administer the program in light of the federal criteria. If you look at Puerto Rico, that's an example where Congress had to pass special legislation, put in a variety of conditions. It created a special board, and the board is in charge of negotiating with creditors and coming up with a reasonable solution, which then needs to be approved by some sort of judicial official. So I think that's the sort of process you would see. Congress first has to decide to do it. It has to establish general criteria and then some sort of board to implement those criteria.
Well, the Congress seems to have already conceded the issue, right, with the Fed setting up a municipal liquidity facility, which you wrote about, and without any congressional pushback that I've heard. There's $500 billion there for the Fed to purchase short-term notes, as you were describing, from the biggest cities and states, even potentially those who've been mismanaging their finances for years, like, say, Chicago and, like, say, Illinois. And so the question in part becomes, with respect to those funds or the funds within the funds, what will the creditworthiness standards be? Because that's something that'll ultimately be promulgated by the Fed, not Congress, correct?
Yeah, for this is now a short-term program. It involves only notes that are about 1 to 2 years. 2 years is the maximum length, and those notes need to be backed by tax receipts. So it's a very narrow program, but the Fed will grant up to 20. Will buy up to 20% of these 20% of a city's or state's general revenues in this program, and the Fed is not, and this is the big thing, Fed is not saying in order to participate in this program, you have to have an investment grade rating. They will buy Chicago bonds and other bonds that are not investment grade ratings, but they say that their pricing will reflect the investment status. So presumably, if they're going to buy bonds from say Wisconsin, they buy them on 100 cents on a dollar, and if they're going to buy bonds from Illinois, they'd buy them at this hypothetical number, 92 cents on a dollar.
Yeah, but here's
85 cents on a dollar. Depends on what they're trading for. What are those bonds trading for now? And that would give you a good indication of what the markets thought the value of those bonds were.
Right, but what they're really doing then is continuing to encourage bad behavior by allowing junk-rated cities like Chicago to continue borrowing against tomorrow to pay for yesterday.
Well, it is true. This is definitely a federal short-term bailout, and the only thing you can say for it is it's a time-limited program. It's supposed to end by sometime in the fall, and it's concentrated on these short-term notes. So it's supposed to be getting through the crisis. But you're right to say the question is whether Congress is now going to respond to Illinois, and I'm sure there'll be lots of other states and cities that will ask for a much broader bailout that will cover its long-term municipal bonds, where the risk of non-payment is much higher. And I hope the Fed won't do this unless there's a congressional mandate to do this, and the congressional mandate should come only after a full discussion and full examination of what's happened to these pension plans. It's not like they've become so underfunded because people just made a mistake or they had a problem from the pandemic in the last 6 months. These systems have been grossly underfunded for the last 10 years. It's not just true of Illinois, it's true of Kentucky, it's true of Connecticut, it's true of New Jersey. So these states have been negligent in the way they've been conducting these systems for years. And so Congress would really have to come to grips with that. And I hope that Congress wouldn't do any sort of bailout without some really strict conditions that would force these pension systems to be substantially reformed.
To that effect, and going back to your Puerto Rico example, it's been suggested by some here in Illinois, one of the things that should be done is to tie any sort of underwriting bailout to access to to federal bankruptcy courts and allowing states to reorganize.
Well, I think that Congress would be very reluctant to have a general law that says any state that chooses to can go into bankruptcy and go to bankruptcy court and essentially abrogate its pension obligations. That seems to me a bad decision if Congress were to make it, because it sets up a general system without much in the way of constraints. That's why what you saw in Puerto Rico was a special statute which said we're allowing this bankruptcy, but only in this case and only under these series of conditions. And so that's, I think, what you would see coming out of Congress, not saying the bankruptcy, you can just file under the normal bankruptcy. Now, the Congress might decide that once it sets up all these conditions, that the Treasury Special Commission or Board to administer it, then it might say ultimately there needs to be approval by a bankruptcy judge. So that might be an appropriate part of the reform, because bankruptcy judges are used to dealing with all these competing claims. But I strongly believe that a general piece of legislation to allow any state that wants to go through normal bankruptcy would be a terrible idea, and I doubt that Congress would do it.
Yeah, maybe we could just get decertified as a state, become a territory, and get the Puerto Rico deal. That's probably.
Well, remember, Puerto Rico couldn't get a deal without a special piece of legislation of Congress. So even if Illinois became a territory, it doesn't get the Puerto Rico deal. Again, Congress has to decide that this is okay, and that there's going to be a lot of conditions involved.
He is Bob Pozen. He's a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, former chairman of MFS Investment Management. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Now that you're spending more time around the house, have you noticed that maybe a few things are needy?
Call Crumweedy!
Crumweedy Home Pros. There's no better investment than your home, and Crumweedy is open, doing proposals and booking jobs. This is a great time to
call Crumweedy!
Right now, no money down, no payments, and no interest for 18 months. Siding, windows, and roofs, all with no money down, no payments, and no interest for 18 months. And there's more. Half-price installation on siding, windows, and roofs.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Call the exterior experts, Crumweedy, Mark Olson, and Greg Olson of Crumweedy, a third-generation family business that's been doing Chicagoland exteriors now since